Hey everyone, so today we're going to be continuing on with the topic of supply and demand, but this time we'll be looking at price controls and the concept of market efficiency. Price controls really refers to when the government comes in and messes with the equilibrium by forcing the price to be either below something or above something. And we're going to see how that affects the overall benefit in the economy. When I say the overall benefit, for that, we're going to talk about something called the economic surplus. We'll talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus, what all that means and how it's affected by government price controls. So first, let's talk about the different price controls. First one is a price floor. Very simple. What is a floor? A floor is the bottom. It's where you're standing. You cannot go below the floor that you're standing on, right? So a price floor is really just a minimum price imposed by the government. The government will impose a minimum price whenever they feel like the equilibrium is too low. So they force the price to be higher. First of all, for a price floor to even work, it needs to be set above the equilibrium. That's an important point. Imagine setting a price floor below equilibrium. It would never get there. What would happen basically is nothing. The market would stay at equilibrium. But if the government imposes a price floor, a minimum price that is above the equilibrium, then it will be effective. And what it'll do, it will move the point of exchange from the equilibrium. So from whatever this is, we'll call this Q0. It'll move it back to Q1 because it's pushing the price up from the equilibrium, which we'll call P0, to whatever P1 is. So by forcing the price to be higher, they're effectively decreasing the amount of quantity that will be purchased, right? Because consumers, like we talked about, the theory of demand, if the price is higher, they're less willing to buy. The opposite of that is a price ceiling, which is a maximum price. The government will do this when they feel like the equilibrium is too high. People are paying too much, like imposing a rent control would be an example of a price ceiling. Rent controls are when the government imposes a maximum to either how much we can charge for rent or how much we can increase the rent by. And the effect is pretty much the same. By forcing the price to be lower, quantity supplied will decrease, and the end result will be that fewer units will be sold because fewer units will be available. Now, what you'll notice here is kind of like before. We're going to move from the equilibrium, which is here, to whatever this quantity is. So we're reducing the quantity from Q0 to Q1 by forcing the price down. One thing that you should know about price ceilings is that they actually create black markets. And I'll explain to you why and how using this graph. So we know that a price ceiling is a maximum price. And let's plug in some fake numbers. Okay, let's say the equilibrium price was $50 and the equilibrium quantity was 100 units. So without any government interference, the market would eventually settle there. But now let's say the government comes and says, no, $50 is way too much. $30 is the price. And the government forces the price to $30. What's going to happen, you're going to have a bunch of suppliers all of a sudden exiting. And let's say the quantity supplied will fall to 50. And then that's the only thing that will be available. So that's all people will buy. Consumers will go out and pay $30 a unit and they'll buy the 50 units. The thing is, if you look at the demand curve and you follow this line all the way up, we know that there are 50 units, or when quantity is 50, consumers are actually willing to pay some higher price. Let's call it $80. So I'll repeat that. At a price of $80, there are actually people who are willing to buy this product. In fact, the amount would be 50. Think of it as there's 50 people that would be willing to pay $80. Let that sink in. At a price of 80, there's 50 people that would be willing to buy. So what's going to happen is somebody's going to buy it at 30 and then flip it to somebody else who is willing to pay 80. And this is what we call the black market price. So by the government forcing the price to be low, they're creating this incentive for people to go out, buy it at the price ceiling, which is $30, and then go into the black market or under the table, call it whatever you want, and sell it to somebody else at $80. So that's the black market price. It's not a very big part of the class, but it does, it is something to know. As I said, rent control is an example of a price ceiling. The other one is an output quota. Now, this one's a little bit different. It's not actually a price control. Instead, it's a quantity control. It's a maximum quantity that the government allows. And this could be done because of pollution or for whatever reason, where the government says, no, you are only allowed to produce this much or a certain amount. The effect of that is effectively the same as a price floor. Because the government forces the quantity from the equilibrium down to whatever this is, the price moves up. It moves from the equilibrium to that. So the end result is exactly like a price floor, where you have lower quantity or fewer units being sold at a higher price. For a price ceiling, it was fewer units being sold at a lower price. And for a price floor, I didn't write this, but let's do it. You had fewer units being sold at a higher price. So you see, this is the same as the quota. So that's kind of step one here, is just kind of understanding what each one of those means. If I say price floor, you understand, okay, price floor is a maximum price. If I say price floor is a minimum price. If I say price ceiling, that's a maximum price. If I say output quota, that's a maximum quantity. That's step one. So let's do a few practice questions on that, make sure it's clear. Again, I would pause the video here and try and answer them on your own. Question number one, government price controls or policies that attempt to maintain what? Do they attempt to maintain the quantity bought at less than the quantity sold? No, that doesn't really make sense. The quantity bought and the quantity sold is pretty much the same thing. Quantity sold at less than the quantity bought, price at some disequilibrium value. That's what it is. The government is trying to force the market to remain at some disequilibrium. Number two, consider a competitive labor market. The likely consequence of a binding minimum wage. So a minimum wage in the labor market is basically a price floor. And the effect that that has, so if we were to look at the labor market is basically, it's the same thing, but instead of saying price, we typically say wages. And instead of quantity, we typically say labor. It's essentially the supply and demand for workers. And you have the supply of workers. So the supply would be the workers. And you have the demand, which is the jobs. So if you impose a minimum wage where the government forces the wages to be higher than the equilibrium wage, what ends up happening is that you have a lot of supply, meaning there's a lot of people that are willing to work, a lot of workers who are willing to work at that wage. But you don't have a lot of jobs because you don't really have a lot of companies that want to pay those higher wages. Think of it logically. If we force wages to be higher, yes, you will get more people willing to work because why not? They're going to make more money. But you're also going to have fewer companies looking to hire. So what ends up happening, this gap here that you would call a surplus when we're talking about goods, this is actually unemployment. When you have too many workers and not enough jobs, that gap is unemployment. Those are all workers that cannot find jobs. So what happens is unemployment. 3, if the government fixes the price of a good above its free market equilibrium. So this is not so different from what we saw just above. You have supply and demand. We're talking about goods, so I'll go back to price and quantity. And we fix the price above the equilibrium. What do we expect? Do we expect a surplus, a shortage, excess demand, a hidden market? Okay, so if you set the price above, you create excess supply, and that excess supply is called a surplus. So A. Okay, so you're given this graph here. In this market, suppose the government sets a price ceiling at P3. So what happens if the government comes in and says, price ceiling, this is therefore a maximum price. We're not going to allow the price to go higher. What would be the black market price? I showed you guys how to do this. The black market price would basically be if you follow, so you want to look at where, so this would be your quantity, A, and then if you follow it up, the black market price would actually be higher than P2. So I'm going to go with P2 because it's the closest one, but in fact, it would be higher than P2. So maybe I'll fix that question. With a price ceiling of P3, so again, this maximum price, what will be the shortage? For shortages and surplus, I think we talked about this in one of the earlier chapters, you look at the gap between supply and demand. So because it hits demand there, but it hits supply here, your shortage is this distance between A and C. So AC. Okay, another one. To be effective, a price floor must lie where? Now, when they ask you questions like this, to be effective, we talked about this. In order for something to be effective, it actually has to work. A floor is a minimum. So for it to work, a minimum has to be above the equilibrium. Cannot be below. If it's below, it wouldn't work. So it would need to be above the equilibrium price, which is P1. So above P1, but below P2, not below P2. It would just have to be anywhere above P1. If the government imposes a floor at P3, so here you'll see what I'm saying. If the government says this is a floor is a minimum, this would have absolutely no effect on the market because the equilibrium is here. The government is saying you can't go below P3. The market isn't even trying to get below P3. It's trying to get to P1. So to say that P3 is your minimum would have absolutely no effect. The market would stay at the equilibrium. So the price and quantity would be P1 and Q0. And the same is true for a ceiling. For a ceiling to be effective, it has to be below. If I were to put a ceiling above, it would have no effect. Okay, remember that. Number 8. Which of the following statements best describes the typical effects of rent control? So the effect of rent control, if I were to graph it out, so you've got here price, which is basically the rent, and the quantity, and think of that as the apartments, the houses that are available. And without any rent control, the suppliers, of course, would be like the landlords, and the demand would be the tenants. Without any rent control, you would be at equilibrium. But if the government imposed rent control, a rent control is a ceiling. And they said, okay, no, you cannot charge more than X amount for rent. What will end up happening is you'll have a shortage in the housing market. You'll have a lot of people demanding housing, a lot of people looking for housing, but you won't have as many houses available. So this is what we call a housing shortage. There's going to be more demand than supply. Okay, so let's look at the options to see if what I just said even matters, but it's important to know it. There is no effect on the distribution of income. No, that's not true. Basically, by enforcing rent control, you're taking money away from the landlords, right? Because the tenants have to pay less, so there's less money going from tenants to landlords. So you're effectively taking money away from the landlords and kind of giving it to the tenants, in a sense. The distribution of income between tenants and landlords changes, yes, but there's no effect on the supply. Also false. We know there's an effect on the supply. It drops from whatever the equilibrium was to whatever this is. There is no effect on the distribution. There is. The distribution of income between tenants and landlords changes, yes, and the availability of rental accommodations is reduced. That's the one. There's going to be fewer rentals available. Here you have more on rent controls. You have two supplies. This is going to tie in a little bit with elasticities. So what you want to understand is, remember how I said in the elasticity chapter that in the long run, supply and demand is more elastic. In the short run, it's more inelastic. So a steeper supply curve, remember, is inelastic. So that typically represents your short run. And then flatter is more elastic, and that's your long run. So what you'll notice is that in the long run, a rent control will create an even larger housing shortage, the gap being from here to here. And the logic here is this. Let's say you own an apartment building. Okay, so let's just follow me through this little story. You own apartment buildings, you charge $800 a month for rent, and you have 1,000 tenants. Okay. All of a sudden, the government comes in and says, nope, you are not allowed to charge more than $600. The thing is, in that moment, there's not much you can do. You have all this property. You're not just going to close it down. You say, okay, well, look, I'm going to lower my rent. I'm going to maybe try and reduce how many tenants I have. So there's going to be a drop in housing, but it's not going to be severe because you don't have time overnight to like sell all your properties. But as time passes and you have more and more time to adjust, you might start selling some of your properties, and then that housing shortage, right? Your supply will fall from 900, which is what it was in the short run, to 400. And this gap between demand and supply will widen. So this question is testing you on that. Suppose the government imposes rent controls of $600. In the short run, we would expect shortages of, in the short run, the shortages are the difference between supply and demand. So if you look here, it's the difference between 900 and 1200. So the answer is 300. The following question is, what about the long run? The housing shortage in the long run would be from 1200 all the way to 400. So it would be an 800 unit housing shortage. Okay, so now market efficiency. From this point, I want you almost to, and I mean, you're not going to have to do this all the time, but another way to think about demand and supply is the following. You could think of every point, or you could think of demand as value, meaning it is the value that a consumer places on a good. And the value basically represents the maximum they would pay. Think of anything you like, anything you would buy. There is a maximum that you would be willing to pay. And that is basically how much you value that thing. Right? If you value something for $50, then that's the most you would ever pay for it. You wouldn't pay $100. So try and imagine that the demand curve represents the value placed on every unit of product. And I'll share an example. Okay, we have quantity here and we have price. Let's say at a price of 100, let's say this intercept is 100, demand is 0. That means what? Nobody is willing to pay $100 for this product. But if you drop the price to 95, you might get the first person who's willing to buy it. What does that mean? It means that that person values that good at $95. That's the maximum they would be willing to pay. That is the value they place on that good. And if you drop to 90, you'll get the second person. So this second person values the good at $90. The first one would be willing to pay 95. The second one would pay 90. The third one, that person's willing to pay 85. And this is just how it works. Different people are willing to pay different prices based on how much they value the good. And this goes on, right? This goes on. This I can get to 80, which would be 4 people. Then I can get to 75, which would be 5 people, and so on and so on and so on. Right? The fourth person is willing to pay 80. The fifth person is willing to pay 75, and then that continues. Now let's bring in supply. If demand is value that the consumer places, think of supply as the cost to the supplier. So it's kind of the same idea. Let me move this aside here. Okay, so we've got our quantity and our price. And let's draw the supply curve like this and say that here, this is at $10. So at $10, nobody's willing to supply. Nobody. That means you wouldn't get, if the price were $10, not a single person would be willing to sell the product. But let's say you move it up to 15, well, now you might get the first supplier. So for this very first supplier, they are willing to sell at $15. So that's the minimum they would accept. That's their cost. They would never accept less than cost. Think about that. The minimum you would ever accept for a good or a service is your cost. So this line represents cost. Now, if the price were 20, now we have a second supplier. So this supplier, the second one, Their cost is $20. So the minimum they would accept is $20. And then this goes on and on and on. Okay, so now that we understand that demand represents value and supply represents cost, what happens when you put the two together? So let's try to make sense of this. So you have your demand, you have your supply. And let's choose a price. Let's choose the equilibrium. And to better understand this, I'll plug in some numbers. Let's say the equilibrium price for whatever this is 50, and the equilibrium quantity is 10. Now, if you think about just what I was saying before about demand and supply, this means that the 10th person, think of it this way, the 10th person to purchase was willing to pay exactly $50. The 11th person, they would have only paid maybe 45, but because the price is 50, they're not interested. The 11th person at 45 would represent somebody who is willing to pay no more than 45. So that's why at 50, they're not in the market. They're saying, oh, too expensive. But there's also everybody before. There's also the person up here who maybe was willing to pay 90, but because the price is 50, we'll pay 50. And this is who we're interested in right now. We talked a moment ago about demand and how every point on the demand curve represents value. So in theory, there's somebody here who is willing to pay 90 but gets to pay 50. There's somebody over here who maybe was willing to pay 80 but gets to pay 50 because that's the price. You see, all of these people have a benefit. This gap here of $40 is called a consumer's surplus. This particular consumer who is willing to pay 90 gets to pay 50 and therefore is gaining $40 of value. Let that sink in. They're getting something that they value at $90. They're paying 50. So it's like they're being given $40 of value. We call that consumer surplus. This person's surplus is 30. Same idea. They're getting something that they value at $80 for 50. We can do this all the way down. Maybe there was somebody who was willing to pay 70 who gets to pay 50. They're gaining $20. The person who is willing to pay 60 who gets to pay 50, they're gaining $10. And then this final person, we call them the marginal buyer. The marginal buyer is basically the last buyer. That person valued it at exactly 50. They don't have a surplus. They're paying exactly what the maximum that they're paying the maximum they were willing to pay. So when you put all this together, it creates this triangle area here, which we call the total consumer surplus. So that top triangle is called the consumer's surplus, the total consumer surplus. The total amount of benefit that consumers are gaining at the particular price. Now let's go to the bottom. Remember that for suppliers, it's kind of the same thing. There was a supplier all the way down here who was willing to accept $10. But because the price is 50, they get to sell it for 50. So they're also gaining $40. Let that sink in for a second. You have a supplier whose cost is 10. Remember, supply is cost. Their cost is 10. They get to sell it for 50. That's like a profit of $40, right? We call this the producer's surplus. And it's the same concept. At every point, there is a supplier who is willing to do it for less, whose cost was less, but they get to sell it for the equilibrium price, and so they have a profit, which we call the producer's surplus. So here, if there was a supplier whose cost is 20, but they get to charge 50, they're gaining $30. Here, if there was a supplier who was willing to charge 30 but gets to charge 50, they're gaining $20. I think by now you're starting to get the gist of it. And then here again, you have the marginal seller. They're selling it for 50 and their cost is 50. They don't have a surplus. They don't have a loss. They just, sell it for exactly what it's worth. So this bottom half here is what we call the producer's surplus. And I actually have all this written here, by the way. Producer surplus, consumer surplus. And when you put this all together, when you combine consumer and producer surplus, you get the total economic surplus. And at equilibrium, the economic surplus is maximized. When the government does not interfere and the market is allowed to get to an equilibrium, that is the point where this area is at its maximum. At any other point, you would have less economic surplus. So if the government comes in and messes around and imposes a floor, a ceiling, a quota, does something to mess with the equilibrium, look what happens. This is an example of a price ceiling. The government comes in and says, maximum price is whatever that is. Look at what happens to the economic surplus. It shrinks. Now it's only this area. And this triangle here is what we call deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is any loss to the total economic surplus or the total economic benefit. Basically, by the government coming in and imposing this price ceiling, they're eliminating all of this in benefit to the economy. So key things to take away. The word efficient means equilibrium. It's where the economic surplus is maximized. At any other point, this is what this bullet point here says, at any other point other than the equilibrium, we are inefficient because we are no longer maximizing the total economic surplus. So this is efficient here, and this is inefficient. Okay, this is what I talked about, consumer and producer surplus. Now we get it. By the way, for economic surplus, here's a trick to know where it is. Because, here I'm showing it on the graph, obviously. But if ever you're looking at a graph and you're like, I don't know where my surplus is. The economic surplus is the area that is between supply and demand and left of quantity. So at equilibrium, your quantity is there. So below demand, above supply, left of quantity. And if you look here, it's the same thing. Below demand, above supply, and left of quantity. But we talked about how a price ceiling would reduce your quantity to this line. So you see by doing so, they shrink the area that is below demand, above supply, and to the left of quantity. This is how you find total economic surplus. Okay, so quite a bit there, I know. Let's do some practice just to get you guys kind of used to it. Don't be shy to reach out to me for questions, right? If there's anything about this that's not clear. Question number 1. When economists describe a market for a specific product as being economically efficient, what do they mean? We talked about this. Efficient just means that you're at your equilibrium and you're maximizing your economic surplus. So production techniques are such that resources are used in the most technologically efficient manner. Consumption of the product is such that economic surplus is maximized. Production of the product is such that economic surplus is maximized. The quantity of the product produced and consumed is such that economic surplus is maximized. I think I like D the most. There are no price controls. I think I like D the most because it talks about production and consumption, not just production, not just consumption. Number 2, each point on the demand curve shows Okay, we talked about this. So every point on the demand curve shows the maximum price that people are willing to pay, right? That's the value. So it's not minimum. So this is the maximum price someone's willing to pay. The demand curve therefore shows the value placed on the product. Then you have this graph. At the market clearing price of $30, so $30 is the price and 4,000 is the quantity. That's your equilibrium. Where is the economic surplus? Perfect opportunity to use the trick I showed you. Economic surplus is the area that is below demand, above supply, left of quantity. So below demand, above supply, left of quantity would be this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7. Sum of the areas below the demand curve above the market clearing price? No. The sum of the areas below the demand curve? No. The sum of the areas above the supply curve but below the market clearing price? No. The sum of the areas above supply, below demand? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. Correct. 4. Suppose this market for gardening services, is that what this was? No, suppose this market is a free market equilibrium. If the government then imposes a price floor of 50, what would be the result? Okay, so we're back to this graph. If the government were to come in and impose a $50 price floor, what would happen, and we talked about this in the beginning of this chapter, the supply would go from 4,000, which is the equilibrium, down to 2,000. So it helps to just draw a line. So this is basically your new quantity. This entire area would be eliminated from the economic surplus because now if you follow this, you have below demand, above supply, left of quantity. This is your economic surplus. So this part is gone. That's what we call deadweight loss. So we would have a loss of economic surplus equal to areas 6 and 7. So the answer would be A here. Okay, number 5, consider Canada's East Coast lobster fishery. Suppose the government sets a production quota which is below the equilibrium quantity. So we have, again, our supply and our demand, and we come in and we say, no, there's a quota here. Relative to the free market equilibrium, we can expect what? An increase in the price. Let's go through it, right? An increase in the price. This is true because the price is going to go from the equilibrium, which was, we'll call that P0, it's going to go up to P1. A decrease in deadweight loss? No. There's going to be an increase in the deadweight loss. In fact, at equilibrium, there is no deadweight loss. So a decrease in the deadweight loss would not make sense. A decrease in the price? No. The free market equilibrium price, because the quota is not binding. It is binding. For it not to be binding, it would have to be set above the equilibrium. That would not work. That would not be binding. It would not be effective. An increase in the price, yes, and an introduction of a deadweight loss, good. Introduction because we're going from not having one at equilibrium to having one. Now you have this graph. The market for good X is in equilibrium at this point right there. Now suppose the government imposes a floor at P2. A floor is a minimum. So what happens? Again, we're moving back from Q0 to Q2. That's your new quantity. The redistribution of surplus from consumers to producers. This is a very tricky question. To understand this, you need to understand consumer and producer surplus. So this is perfect. Consumer surplus is the area that is below demand, above price, and to the left of quantity. And producer surplus is the area that is above supply, below price, to the left of quantity. So if I backtrack here and I go to my equilibrium. At equilibrium, which is right here, you're basically getting, and you're splitting this triangle in half. Okay, so look, below demand, above price, left of quantity. Consumer surplus at equilibrium would be 1, 2, and 5. And for producer surplus, it would be above supply, below price, left of quantity. So producer surplus at equilibrium would be 3 and 6. You have to know that, right? Now, the government comes in and says, we're going to mess with this. We're going to impose a floor at P2. So let's see what happens. The quantity moves to Q2. And now we're going to do this again. Below demand, above price. But now price is P2 and quantity is Q2. So look at your consumer surplus. Your consumer surplus went from being 125 to being just 1. And if you follow this rule, above supply, below price, price is P2 and left of quantity, the producer's surplus went from being 3.6 to being 2.3. So when they ask you, so that's one thing just to take away is what I showed you here. This is how you identify consumer and producer surplus and how much each one is going to benefit at different prices. So you see at this price, the producers are much better off than the consumers. Look at the size of this area. That's their benefit. Look at the size of the consumer's benefit. It's really small. So at a price of P2, the producers are much better off than the consumers. The question, though, is what is the redistribution of surplus from consumers to producers? So what portion of the surplus was taken from the consumers? This is redistribution, taken from one and given to the other. That's just 2. Because look, 2 went from being part of the consumer surplus to being part of the producer surplus. So the answer is area 2. Tricky question. But that's how you would think about it. When I say redistribution, I'm just saying, was there any part of one surplus that was moved to the other? Was there any part of the consumer surplus that was moved to the producer surplus as a result of this floor? Okay, then you've got this table here. Consider the market equilibrium. So the equilibrium to me is right here at $50 because there's quantity supply and quantity demand are the same. If the government were to require that production increase to 900, require that production increase to 900. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, so now this question is a little bit tricky because we're trying to imagine pushing the market beyond the equilibrium. So we can see, according to the graph, according to the table, that the equilibrium is at $50 and 700 units. So if I were to plot supply and demand, they would cross each other at a quantity of 700 and a price of 50. And this would be efficient. This would be the maximum economic surplus. Then it says, what if the government required production increase to 900? So 900 would be here. Now, if you look at the table, at 900, in order for the producers to sell 900 to the consumers, they would have to charge $30. That's the only way you're going to get the consumers, the demand, to be 900. The problem is the cost if you look for it on the graph, at 900 units, the cost to the suppliers is 70. So the suppliers are forced to charge, they're forced to produce goods that they would have to sell at a loss. And this area here that I'm highlighting in green would represent the deadweight loss. This whole area is not a surplus because for it to be a good thing, the value has to be greater than the cost. Like over here on the left, all of this is good because the value, which is demand, exceeds the cost, which is supply. That means that there's a benefit to both parties. When it flips where cost exceeds value, that's just a net loss. So if we can find the area of that triangle, we should have our answer. So now we're just going to do a bit of geometry. We have a triangle where the base, we'll call it, is that from 70 to 30. 70 to 30 is 40. The height, we'll say, is from here to here. So that's 200 because it's 700 to 900. So 40 times 900 divided by 2. So I'm doing base times height divided by 2. And that should give you 4,000. So anytime your supply is above your demand, normally the market would not even bother going there. The market would never get to a point where the cost exceeds the value. But if the government were to force it, it would create a negative there. It would create a negative effect on the economy, and that whole area would be a loss in the economy. One thing that I guess we didn't really talk about, I didn't see it so much in the notes, but just one last thing before we wrap this section up. If ever you were actually asked to calculate the surplus, surpluses are just areas. So I want to make sure that that part's understood. Let's say you have a situation where your price is 50 and your demand is 700. And I don't know, let's say your intercept up here is 100. And I said, what is the consumer's surplus? Well, the consumer surplus is this area. So you would actually calculate the area. I'm talking about geometry here. So base times height divided by 2. So in this case, it would be 700 would be your base, 50 would be your height, 50 being the gap here, divided by 2. $17,500. That would be the consumer's surplus in this particular example. Now, let's say that the government imposed some kind of floor or ceiling. Let's call it a floor. And they forced the price to be 70. And that, in turn, reduced the quantity to 500. Like we said earlier, this would create a deadweight loss of this area. So again, if you were asked, what is the deadweight loss? Again, you're just doing geometry and you'd be looking for that area. All this to say, guys, that consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss, these are all areas on the graph that in order to find, you just have to do the geometry. So this is a triangle, it would be base times height again. So if you have any questions at all about this, please reach out. I will see you next time.